James Naismith. He was the inventor of basketball, and he was a Freemason. He had ties both in Massachusetts and here in Kansas, but he had so much to his life that deserves to be remembered farther than what is typically remembered, especially in Freemasonry. We're going to talk about that interesting story behind Brother Naismith this evening, and we have an excellent guest on with us this evening that's going to help walk us through that and the really unique aspects of his life and the differences that he made that most do not know about. So stick with us because we have an amazing episode lined up for you right after this on Historical Light.
Welcome back to the Historical Light Masonic Podcast, dedicated to illuminating our past and bringing our Masonic history to light since 2016. And now, enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Historical Light. I'm Alex Powers, your host. This is Historical Light, an independent Masonic show focused on the historical events and aspects within Freemasonry. We have an excellent guest on with us this evening, Brother Michael Jarzabek, all the way from Massachusetts. My brother, thank you so much for being here. And if you wouldn't mind, for those that do not know you, would you mind giving us a little bit of a background of just who you are and your background in Masonry?
Thanks for having me on. Mike Jarsvik. I'm from Grand Lodge, Massachusetts. Member of Brigham Lodge in Ludlow, Massachusetts, and past junior Grand Warden of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and the current director or chairman of education and training.
Fantastic, man. Thank you so much for being on. And it's good to see you again. We just got to see you not too long ago down here for MasonicCon, Kansas, which you were here to talk about Brother Naismith. And it's awesome because we have this really cool connection, both from your home jurisdiction and right here in Kansas. But unfortunately, we never get to know this deeper behind the scenes side of Naismith that I'm super stoked to dive in with you this evening on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we get there, though, we usually try to start off with a few icebreakers just to get to know you before we get into our topic. So the two ones we start off with here are, first of all, do you have family history prior to you in Freemasonry?
So my great grandfather was a Mason, and I have his, a Masonic coin with the dates of his 3 degrees on it. But I didn't really ever know him. But outside of that, not that I'm aware of.
All right. So having some connection there, but maybe not knowing him so well, did that play an impact of you joining Freemasonry? Or what was it that actually made you want to make that leap into becoming a Freemason?
So the funny thing is that, I've heard a lot of great stories about people joining Freemasonry, and unfortunately mine's not one of those great stories. So I had gotten out of the military and went to North Dakota, and I came back to Connecticut where I grew up. And, almost everybody that I knew was gone except for a few friends. And the story kind of starts a little bit earlier than when I joined, in that one of those friends was in Amway. And so he was, that's what he was doing with all his time. So I joined that. I mean, I think it was $150 at the time. And it's just a way for me to connect with somebody again at a different level, because you go away, you leave, and people grow up and they change. But I never really got into that because I figured if I had to put that much work into anything, I'd be successful. So it really didn't interest me to sell products. I'm not much of a salesman.
Sure.
But fast forward a little bit, and he joins the Freemasons. And so I was doing some electrical work on a pizza shop that was a friend of his. And he's like, "Hey, I joined this thing. You should join." And I'm like, "What's it all about?" And he's like, "Oh, you get further light." And I'm like, "All right, what's that mean?" And he's like, "You have to find out." And honestly, the way my mindset was, and I think I asked how much it cost, and he was like $75, and I'm like, "Oh, that's cheaper than Amway, and I spent way more money on stupider things than that. So I'm curious, I'll check it out." So that's really how I came to Masonry, and then that was Connecticut, and I moved to Massachusetts a couple months later, and I never really went to that lodge, and I joined up here, and got really involved up here, and now it's a huge part. I can't even imagine not doing it. That was 20 years ago.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, you've had quite the Masonic journey. I mean, I know when I first had the pleasure to meet you was up in Ezekiel Bates for one of the original Masonicons, and I believe you were serving as Grand Junior Warden at the time.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I mean, you've had a really impressive journey, but I'm curious, beyond those matters, what is it that's really kept you around? What is it that's really locked you in and makes you still want to be a Freemason to this day?
So I would say first, it's probably the connections, like the friendships that like you and I have, and RJ
Definitely.
and a bunch of other guys. I mean, we have, it seems like we pulled this group together all throughout the country, and then even brothers in my own lodge and own jurisdiction as well. Um, but honestly, it filled a need for me. I was probably when I joined, I was somewhere around I was 25 years old, I think. Um, you know, really into the band Rage Against the Machine, really wanted to change the world and make it a better place, but coming from a really angry place, like of I didn't like seeing some of the injustices and the um just the bad stuff that happens in the world. And I was
Yeah.
frustrated by it. So being frustrated by it, but I didn't really know what to do with that. Um and I think a lot of people are like that at that age, or around that age, that it becomes a destructive thing because you just have this energy, I have nowhere to put it. So I joined Freemasonry, and as I went up through the line, I started to realize I started to learn how to do things and how to express myself. And I think it gave me a voice of sorts too, because when I first joined the lodge, and my wife will tell you this, and she may have already told you this, I wouldn't look a waitress in the eye. I was that shy. And it was probably just things that had happened in my life that I felt beat down.
Sure.
But Freemasonry kind of gave me some of that confidence back, and it gave me a way to express that energy in a more productive way. And I think really the turning point for me, and what really does it for me, is that there was a thing on the radio where the school in our town had budget cuts, and they couldn't do any, um, they couldn't fund some programs. So I scheduled a meeting with the principal of our school and said, "We're going to fix that. Like, what do you need? Like, we'll do a fundraiser for you. We'll figure something out." And we started doing a fundraiser, just selling spaghetti, and we bought books for a library. Um, and that went on to make like $3,000 the first year. And it was like this big cultural event that like the school band, like the jazz band, would show off, and kids would show off their artwork, and like kids would come up from the middle school to get acclimated, or from the elementary school to get acclimated. But it was this way I learned that I didn't have to be frustrated, that I could find a positive outlet, and that I could build things
Right.
in my community. So that's I think that's really what really attracted me, is that chance to be able to build virtue and to build community. And that's really attracted me ever since. Um, and then I met guys like you and Brian and RJ and Dago that, kind of are the same way. And together we're even stronger, I think. So, it just builds on itself.
Man, such a strong answer there. That's fantastic. And honestly, I've been so blessed to have the opportunity to get to know you, and definitely sharing those. So I mean, yeah, those relationships you're talking about is 100% one of a kind, and definitely makes the Masonic experience 100%. All right, man, I am stoked to get into this because while I got to hear most of it at Masonicon, I was also running around like a mad horse, so I didn't get to hear all the details. But you brought out a side of Naismith. So many like factors. I always knew the high level stuff. You know, he had this time in Kansas. He spent time as a Kansas Freemason. We rededicated the DeBruce Hall a few years ago when it was established. Like all these main points that you see all the time. But you brought out this personality of his true life behind the scenes that blew my mind. And I am stoked to have that conversation and kind of dig in on a few of those topics. Before we get into the meat and potatoes here, I do want to break over and give everyone an opportunity and a huge thanks, of course, to everyone that has supported the show. We've been around since 2016 and we are viewer funded. Love to keep growing and keep bringing you guys more Masonic light through our history, our proud history, supporting that, archiving that, and sharing it. So if you want to support the show, you like what you see here, you can always do so by going over to the website, historicallight.com/support, and you can jump on and support us through Patreon. And yes, you can do that through PayPal within the Patreon system. So we have some awesome new things in the works. Of course, we've always had our regular lapel pins, but our exclusive Patreon subscribers now have their very own lapel pin that just came in, and they're going to get an exclusive look at that, and then we'll have those posted on the site soon. So if you like those and you want to get in on those, make sure you jump on and join us on Patreon and support the show. All right, man, I want to get into this topic. So James Naismith. Now, we talked about he was a Kansas Mason, past master of actually the lodge that my uncle and my grandfather were raised in Lawrence. But that's not where his Masonic journey began. And I think you're a little closer to home to that. So before we get into kind of this backstory, would you mind giving just a little bit of, I guess, build up of where his Masonic journey began closer to your neck of the woods?
Yeah, so James Naismith joins Roswell Lee Lodge in 1894 in Springfield, Massachusetts. So to get to where Naismith, like we kind of have to put the setting in there. So Naismith comes from Canada. He's a student, and a reluctant kind of. He always wanted to get away from sports, and it kind of always kept calling him back, despite the detriment of his family didn't like it very much. They were ashamed of it. But we have to set the stage of, a lot of people might not be familiar with Springfield, Massachusetts, but Springfield, Massachusetts in that time period is pretty much the Detroit in its heyday, of then. The first gasoline powered car is made there. Vulcanized rubber is invented there.
Right.
What else is the dictionary, the Webster's dictionary, I believe. Just all these different things are coming from here. So this is a really dynamic and vibrant city at that point in time. And a lot of that has to do with where the story starts, in my mind, is when Henry Knox wants to work on the production line, wants to work on not so much the production line, but interchangeable parts. They want to come up with interchangeable parts. So he asked Eli Whitney to come up to the Springfield Armory, which him and George Washington had sited, because it was far up the Connecticut River, and boats couldn't get up there. There's mountain ranges around it, so it was very protected. It was a good place to put the armory. So he wants to bring in Eli Whitney, but Eli Whitney's kind of busy with the things he's doing, and he says, "You know what? I got a better idea. I'll send you this guy, Roswell Lee, and he'll come up and he'll help you." So Roswell Lee goes to the armory and he builds this whole community, and he ends up bringing on Thomas Blanchard, who creates the repeating lathe, which changes the way that they made rifles, but changes the world really. And it kickstarts the second industrial revolution in Springfield. So Naismith comes in, quite a bit later, but Naismith comes into this YMCA. He comes to the YMCA training school, which is kind of a reaction in a lot of ways to the industrialization that Roswell Lee brings in. And so he comes to that school to learn how to be, how to run a gym, how to run a YMCA. He's really interested in being a physical education instructor. And, he invents basketball in 1891, but in 1894, he signs these bylaws right here. And so what's interesting, what I like to point out, is he's halfway down, and I'm sure we can put this in the chat or whatever later, but he signs it as instructor. So you get this guy that invented basketball, and some people might say that it's only been 3 years. Who knew what basketball was? But it was already all around the world at that point. And so he comes into the lodge. He comes into the lodge during that time period, 1894. Already had invented basketball, like I said. Was very involved in the physical education field, and that's kind of where his story starts, in that reaction to the Industrial Revolution, to try to help these men that came off these farms, to develop the parts of their bodies that they no longer were developing, and develop their minds and their souls at the same time.
Right. So then when he got into Freemasonry, he was raised in your lodge, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Which is pretty cool. And then, so I'm trying to remember at what point he ended up moving to Kansas. Do you recall what year that was?
I'm not sure. I think it was around 5 years later. He stops off in Colorado in the interim. But I do want to clarify too that, so he's a member of my lodge. My lodge merged with another lodge, and there's probably
that's right.
There's a series of like 10 mergers. But in our lodge, in that area, in that time period, we had Roswell Lee himself. We had George Hendy, who was the founder of Indian Motorcycle. We had James Naismith. There was just like name after name. We're still discovering names in this period. Like if you go through that book, and so the lodges that they came of. So I'm fortunate enough that we merged, and I was able to find that history.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, unfortunately, so many times, and we've talked about this in other episodes, but like when lodges go through that merger, so many times those records just get either completely left or shoved in a side closet or just totally forgotten about. They're very rarely kind of put at that forefront of, there's something valuable here, we need to go through it. The fact that you guys still have that, the fact that you've gone through it and found those bits, speaks so highly. And obviously why we do these, archival majors is for that, to find those little bits, to connect those much larger dots, which is huge, and was amazing that, it got to the point where you're able to bring that stuff here to Kansas and try to have those documents. Lawrence Lodge, what was the document that they brought that had his signature on it?
So they had a copy of his application in Kansas, and they also had a copy of his demit form from Massachusetts, which I believe, now that I think about it, the demit was from 1927, but I think he was in Kansas well before that, and just hadn't really got engaged with Masonry in Kansas until later.
Just kind of kept on with his Massachusetts membership. That makes total sense. So now that's really cool. Now he comes here to Kansas and ends up getting involved with the University of Kansas, KU University. And we see kind of this picture that you painted when he's in Springfield and he gets involved with the YMCA and those different aspects of kind of building that moral character behind the scene. And then it's not enough talked about, but you found these facts that really kind of exploit that same aspect of him here during his employment at KU, and kind of how he impacted the world in a silent manner, into multiple ways. Would you go on a little bit than that? I know we talked about one of his employees that was kind of untraditional in the time.
Yeah. So he comes to Kansas. It was Chancellor Snow, I believe, hires him on, and he doesn't even come there. He doesn't come there as a basketball coach.
Right.
In reality, Naismith doesn't think basketball should be coached. He thinks it should be played. And he actually tells Fog Allen that. He tells Fog Allen that in better words, he says basically he's an idiot because he's going to be a coach because he shouldn't be coaching. That's not how it should be done. Luckily, Fog Allen didn't listen to him, and goes on to be one of the most famous coaches in history. But he goes there to be a chapel director and a physical education teacher. That's it. It's not a lot of fanfare, but they recruit him, and he comes for that. So Naismith, there is some untraditional things that happen there, but it's not different to his character, because even when he's in Springfield, within probably days of inventing basketball, Naismith teaches it to a group of women from Smith College. And it actually impacts the sport negatively in some places because people thought it was a girls' sport and they didn't want to play it. I think England and Africa and some countries in Africa were particularly. So what's interesting is that later on, well into towards the end of his career, Naismith is basically just a physical educator. He's just a teacher at that point, a professor. But a young man comes into his office who wanted to learn about basketball, wanted to go to Springfield College because that's the YMCA training school is now known as Springfield College, because he knows Naismith went there. And his dad said, well, he's over at KU now, so why don't we go over to KU and, you can ask him to mentor you. So he walks into Naismith's office and says, hey, I heard you're going to be my mentor. And Naismith said, well, who told you that? And he says, my father. And he goes, well, fathers are usually right, so sit down. So the interesting thing about this is that Kansas University at the time is a segregated school. And the kid that comes into his office, John McClendon, is black. And Naismith chooses to mentor him anyway. We'll get into this a little more, but why that's important to me is that Naismith looks at basketball as a tool for creating virtue and a tool for changing communities. So the fact that he wants to give those tools to a person that comes from a background that is marginalized, and we know that Kansas had a decent background when it came, they weren't a slave state. They had definitely a better reputation than most of their neighbors, but nonetheless, it was a segregated school at the time, and McClendon couldn't play basketball there. He wasn't allowed. There was no mixed race teams at the time, and there was no black basketball team at the time. So what happens is he comes in and he teaches him how to be a coach. So so McClendon becomes, I think, one of the first African American students at Kansas University. Period. He's definitely one of the few. And one of the requirements at the time at KU is that you have to swim in the pool, which is similar to, I think KU has a similar background to Springfield College, in that even to this day in Springfield College, you have to take a physical education course, a philosophy course, or a religion course, and your regular course load, or you don't graduate. And I think KU probably had similar things where you had to have some physical education. In this case, they wanted you to swim. Well, we all know that back then, the way people looked at things, they didn't want to swim in the same water as a black man. So, you don't get anything that's very graphic in what happened, but evidently whatever happened was nasty enough where they would drain the pool on him if he tried to go swim there. So Naismith grabs two of the football players at KU and tells them to sit by the pool, and if anyone messes with John McClendon, to take care of it. So this is the first thing. Of course, that doesn't make him popular. In fact, it probably makes things worse in some ways. And there starts to be racist signs put up all throughout the campus. Well, Naismith collects a bunch of the signs as McClendon shows them to him. Naismith collects a bunch of the signs, and he brings them into the chancellor's office and says, "I will quit here tomorrow if you don't put a stop to this." Now, it's interesting to me that it seems like such a obvious thing to do, right? But we're thinking this is 1930s Kansas.
Yeah, I mean, obvious today, right? And so you mentioned, Kansas was on the free state side of things, but where Lawrence is situated is right in the Kansas City metro, and we're really close to that border area. And through that entire time, I mean, it was a nasty back and forth, right? I mean, even on the Kansas side, there was plenty of people with those same views, um, and going through even in that time period when he's doing this, like, yes, Kansas has a more favorable opinion going back, but at the same time, that speaks volumes because he wasn't the celebrity at the time, right? Like, I mean, he didn't have that to back him or secure him or keep him safe in his job and his community standing, anything. Like, obviously, as we see, I mean, you're talking about they're going to drain the pool just to keep this kid out of the same water as they want to use. Like, for Naismith to step up in those situations, I mean, that's a real deal. Like, that could put his livelihood in jeopardy, his place in the community, like, and he's willing to stand up for what is right in a time period in the country that was still extremely aggravated and charged in that negative light. And that just speaks volumes to that moral character within Naismith that doesn't get talked about nearly enough.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And it goes on from there, and it'd be one thing if he just taught McClendon, and you're like, okay, McClendon was learned to be a basketball coach, but McClendon goes on to invent the fast break, the four corners offense, a few other things, become the first African American coach of a Caucasian team, the first African American coach of any team, any professional team of any sport, and the first African American coach in the Olympics. He's not a head coach of the Olympics, but he's a coach in the Olympics on the team.
But to think about the impact that he had in those areas, I mean, that's mind blowing, because if Naismith hadn't have taken some of the steps he made, where would we be in that realm of the world, right? What would basketball be today, if anything? But then, because he took those really controversial measures and took on to this mentorship, look what this guy went on and did. Yeah. Like, where would basketball be without him as well? Just, that whole face really plays in piece by piece here, which is fascinating. Real quick, before you get back into what you were saying, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. I didn't catch this before, but so you're saying that he started out back in Springfield and came to Kansas to follow Naismith. Was that correct?
No, he wanted to go to Springfield. He was from Kansas.
Oh, he was from here, wanted to, got you.
But his family didn't have a lot of money. They couldn't afford to send him to Springfield. And then he, by divine providence or whatever, he happens to be live miles away from where Naismith is teaching. Like, the guy he wants to go learn from is just like in his backyard, and he doesn't even realize it.
Just meant to be.
Yeah. And so, to your point of like the impact he had, the crazy part to me is that's one guy. Like, Naismith had a lot of reach, through the YMCA movement and through the muscular Christianity movement. He had a ton of reach. And so every time I dig, I just find more and more. And even with McClendon, those parts aren't even the most interesting parts. I mean, he becomes he gets inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame twice, once as a contributor and once as a coach. But to me, the most important thing is that he wants to go take a master's course after he finishes his coursework at Kansas. So Naismith doesn't have a lot of money. Naismith never capitalized on any of his fame He didn't really believe that professional basketball was a good thing. He thought that collegiate and high school basketball was better.
Mm.
He refused to take money um, from tobacco companies because he didn't believe in tobacco. He thought it was immoral, so he didn't want to profit off of that. So he lived. He was very, very. I don't want to say destitute, but he was kind of living hand to mouth. But
Right.
McClendon asked, he says, can you help me get into a master's program? Again, we already know what he went through at Kansas. So I'm sure 4 years later, there's a lot of places in the country that don't really want to educate a black man in, to get their master's degree. So
Yeah.
McClendon, Naismith pulled some strings with the connections that he had, because he had plenty of connections. He was rich in connections, although not in money. He pulls some strings and gets him in, I believe, at the University of Iowa. He goes to the University of Iowa. His major at the University of Iowa, his thesis was that he disproved the difference in the physiological, he proved that there was no physiological difference in the races, which sounds like, again, it sounds like just so obvious to us in like a modern mind. But, in the Olympics, after Jesse Owens wins 4 Olympic medals, the major argument at that time period was that Jesse Owens was closer to an animal than he was to a human being. So of course he won those medals. And it wasn't fair. They were basically saying it wasn't fair for people to have to compete against him for that reason. So this is very, very important, a very, very important discovery, or a very important proof that McClendon proves. And Naismith, by him saying yes to him when he walks into his office, by him defending him and helping him get through the coursework when other people would rather see him fail, and by him pulling strings, Naismith's connected to that. He never takes credit for it. And, I don't think he should take credit for it, because McClendon did the work. But nonetheless, I mean, he has a hand in it. And I think it's important, especially in that time period. And nobody talks about it. It's like Naismith's all, he invented basketball. And even when I started researching him, I'm like, oh, there's nothing more to it. Like, he's probably pretty boring. This is going to be a short talk, when I started writing the talk. But he's not. And the more you dig, the more you find it's not the exception. It's basically the rule in his life, whether it's teaching women to play basketball, whether it's teaching McClendon to coach basketball, and countless other people, whether it's teaching people with physical disabilities at KU. There was a runner that ended up being an Olympic athlete that I can't remember the guy's name, but Naismith, basically, one of the comments was that he overhears this gentleman telling other people how to catch a second wind in running. And he goes up to him and he says, like, you can't say that to them. And he goes, what do you mean? Why can't I say it? And he goes, because you're going to kill them, because they don't have half the heart that you have. But Naismith really, and McClendon says this, and I don't have the exact quote at the top of my mind, but Naismith says basically that, or McClendon says about Naismith, that Naismith never had a racist bone in his body, that all Naismith saw in people was potential. And
that's
that
beautiful.
His job, his like reason for living, was to help people discover that potential in themselves. We need more James Naismiths out there.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean, yeah, like I said, and even being on that Kansas side, obviously, as we see how some of those kids and stuff treated them, like I think a lot of it was more quiet than non-existent, right? And man, I would love to see the face when he turned, not Naismith, but the other guy, when he turned in his thesis paper, being on that, because especially going back into so much of just the idiotic racist rhetoric that you would see, that was one of the key factors that you would see so much, is trying to paint that divide, that African Americans are not human. They're savage, they're different from us, and to go in there and, from an educated standpoint, a master's thesis paper, be able to, from that level, disprove it on an academic level, especially in that time period. I mean, holy cow.
Yeah. And he
Speaks
definitely builds
volumes.
off Naismith with that, because Naismith is he's an ordained minister, but he's also a doctor. I mean, and he's not a doctor of religion. He's a doctor. He's a physical, like a
Right.
medical. He has a medical degree, and he and he's a coach. I mean, so he has all these different parts to himself, and so I'm sure that he wasn't just mentoring him and how, like, here's how you coach basketball. I'm sure he was mentoring him on the entire package, and part of that package was probably the basis for the scientific work that he was able to do to prove that. Because it's not a sociological thing; it's a very scientific paper. And you find that with Naismith, like he's an inventor. One of the things, I found an article recently from a newspaper of the time period in Kansas where Naismith invents the first like chronological tool to measure splits on a track. So it's this thing that has like electrical switches with like bamboo reeds, so that as you run by you hit the bamboo reeds, it makes a reading on this and gives you the splits as you're running, like I thought every 100 meters or whatever. And they give him credit for inventing that. So yeah, I just it's all those things that kind of come together to make him so interesting. And even we talked about how he doesn't have a lot of money. 1936, the Olympics, the basketball debuts as a competitive sport. It had been kind of in the past, it had been an exhibition kind of thing. But it was the first time in 1936 in Berlin that it was competitive, and Naismith can't afford to go. So Fog Allen puts together this like campaign, Pennies for Naismith, raising enough money so Naismith and his wife can go to Germany and see the sport that he invented debuted for the first time in the Olympics, which Naismith says is the most important thing he's ever done in his life, like that he's ever seen. It's like the best thing he's ever seen. So McClendon comes up to him and says, "Hey, I need to earn some money for something. Can I do anything for you to earn money?" And Naismith lets him mow his lawn, and he pays him 50 cents to mow his lawn. And I believe what I read at the time period was the 50 cents is basically like you could make about 35 cents a week at the time, right?
Oh, wow.
He gives him like a week's wages to mow his lawn on the weekend. And McClendon turns around and puts that back into the campaign so he can go to Berlin. Right, so
that's fantastic.
He tricks him into funding his own campaign, which is kind of, Naismith could have used the 50 cents, maybe, I don't know, but
that's
just
fantastic.
shows how selfless he is, right? Like,
100%. Yeah, like you said, when you started out with this, this presentation in mind, just thinking there's not much more to it than his tie to basketball, and that's kind of about all that was wrote. And sadly, that's all I really knew either. Those high points and oh cool, and he's got this connection to Masonry. And unfortunately, anybody that has any remote connection to like some level of fame, if there is a Masonic tie, doesn't matter anything in the backside, that person is just going to be elevated. Like, man, he was a Mason, and just throw it out there in any which way you can. And largely that's happened to Naismith just around the fact of basketball. Nobody knows like this true side of Naismith. And man, when you delivered, the parts that I was able to sit there and watch was just absolutely beautiful. Just to bring this guy's true life back to life and kind of get to know him on that deeper level. Basketball is obviously extremely important to him and a huge part of who he was, but he had this like almost larger aspect to him that just needed to be heard, that really nobody talks about or knew about until, guys like you have the, just the inertia to go connect those dots and dig up a little bit and really bring out who this guy truly was, especially in a time period where that was going against the grain in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I found even more about him after the talk. Like, I think Robert and I were talking, and all of a sudden, I happened upon this thing. So Naismith served with Pershing in the Pancho Villa, the raids across the Pancho Villa raids across the border,
Yeah.
so the National Guard gets called up. He gets called up into the National Guard as a Canadian citizen, and at 54 years old. So he gets called in the service. When he gets called up, he leaves so fast that he forgets his teeth at home, and he has to have his wife mail them to him. Right. And he goes down to serve. So I'm like, well, what did he do? He just like, what did he do on the border? I didn't really know. And so I started digging into that. So he was a chaplain basically on the border. And so they tell these basically what he did. One of his major things was keeping guys out of the whorehouses. Like that was his thing. And so you think of it as like, okay, so this is going to be this guy that's just playing the morality police, and because he's religious, he's going to put religion on everybody else. But there's this story out there where when he first gets down there, the paymaster, because they used to get paid in cash, and the paymaster would pay you out. Well, the paymaster runs off with his money. Naismith's not there that week or whatever, runs off with his money. So all the other officers are like, you got to bring that guy up on charges. This is horrible. And he's like, the kid doesn't have the money anymore anyway. What's the difference? And he just goes without for like a week or whatever the time period is until he gets his next paycheck. And he writes back to his wife, and in a letter to his wife, he says basically that the reason that he's so tough on keeping the kids out of those, houses of ill repute is because he doesn't want them to live the same life that he did that week when he didn't have any money. And that those places are places where guys get robbed, and just the act of going there is going to cost you money, and the drinking and everything else that goes around with it. That he felt like it was unhealthy and it was detrimental to them as human beings, not as God's gonna like tell you that you sinned or whatever. That wasn't his approach. His total approach was just that he cared enough about people that he didn't want to see them served with any misfortune.
Right.
So you think of that, like in this Pancho Villa raid. So you have Blackjack Pershing from Missouri, right? Makes it from Missouri. You have General Patton, who makes his way into that campaign, and you have James Naismith there all at the same time in this like raid, and Naismith's basically on the border. But after that, he goes back and he ends up enlisting again with Pershing, and he goes to World War I, and he goes to France, and he serves as like a director of like basically what becomes what's in the service now, what's in the military now, like a MWR, a morale, like a recreation and wellness kind of program, where his thing is he can keep them out of those kind of places again in over there by having them play basketball, by giving them something positive to do with their time, because he figures if they have a bunch of time on their hands, then that's when they're going to do all these other things. I think he even invents another sport, which never really caught on. He thought it was going to be bigger than basketball, but I can't even tell you what it is. And he invents that sport. I think it was in Mexico when he was on that campaign, as a pastime for the troops, and sets up like another basketball league there. It's just amazing that the stuff that he did in that one life period. And
right.
What amazes me at that time period more than any, I think really resonates with me of the Second Industrial Revolution through this, like, I guess through the Gilded Age into the Progressive Era, is like really his time period of being. And he's kind of like a representative of that entire era, of just the inventiveness and, to bring it full circle where we started this conversation. He's a guy that he sees a problem and he knows that he can get in there and roll up his sleeves and get something done and fix it. And, I don't know if that, masonry came later to him. So sometimes I think with masons, it's the chicken and the egg, like which came first. Did
Right.
masonry make them who they were, or did masonry just like amplify who they were already?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, masonry touches on many of these aspects of what I call, these universal truths. And I think there has to be parts of you that are already in alignment for it to really click with you uh, and, take on from that point. I think Naismith obviously was a very, very genuine person below. When you're someone that's of that frequency, I guess you could say, um, I think, a practice such as masonry is just intended to excel that much more and be that much more powerful within you. It's that toolkit for guys like him. So I mean, yeah, it was a huge fact that he got involved in. You know, what came first? I'm sure in many ways he came. A lot of that was just natural to him. That's who he was. Masonry was just a conduit to continue that on and potentially grow it. But I mean, yeah, such an impactful story. So when you were here, one of the really cool things we got to do, we had the opportunity to get you up to Lawrence. For one, to go visit his final resting place. He's buried in Lawrence, not too far from campus. And I know that was really important to you to try to fit that in during the trip. And it was a little funny because we get to the cemetery out there, and they've got this massive monument right up front. And all the time I've lived in Kansas my whole life. I was actually born in Lawrence, but I'd never been out to see that. So that was first time for me as well. And they've got this huge monument, but it's like, well, where is he buried? We
Yeah.
walked that whole cemetery until we found him kind of in the very, very back. Just
Yeah.
would have never known. But so now they have the DeBruce Center on campus there, and that's kind of got the basketball uh, museum in there, and they've even got the original rules to basketball in their Smithsonian style vault here in
Yeah.
Kansas. We throw up a few pictures because these aren't from our trip. I wish I was better prepared and grab some of the pictures from us being out there. But I did have these in a file from the Grand Lodge dedication when the DeBruce Center was built and dedicated uh, not too far in the past. So this is kind of the building here, and we see. I think my cursor's showing up here. Right outside here, we got a cool picture with you sitting next to him, but there's this really neat statue of Naismith sitting on the bench out there, right in front of the DeBruce Center. So here is some of the photos from the dedication ceremony. And when I was speaking to uh, the director or executive director of Kansas Masonic Foundation, he was saying actually he's going to get one of these in the mail to you, brother, for the knowledge on Naismith that you brought to us at MasonicCon Kansas. But you see here they put together this really nice placard, poster, whatever you want to call it, with a really cool photo of Naismith and then his petition into Masonry here in Kansas on the right. And should have one of those in the mail to you in the near future. But they also have one of those hanging in the DeBruce Center, kind of showing off his Masonic connections as well, which I think is really cool.
That's amazing.
So we just have some really neat, and we talked about this. They've got all these different sayings from Naismith on the exterior of the building. And I remember we were walking by it. You're like, man, they need to have some kind of a recorder out there just
Yeah.
reading those off as you walk by.
Yeah. Those are the rules. I think, those are the original 13 rules.
And there's Brother Woodward, who unfortunately just passed away on the right there just last year. There's that awesome statue.
Yeah.
And then over in front of Allen Foghouse Stadium, there's kind of a life-size statue of Allen over there as well.
who I later learned was also a member of Lawrence Lodge.
Was he really? I did not know that.
Yeah, that's what I
That's
learned
interesting.
from one of the brothers there. He said, "Yeah, Fog Allen was a member too."
That's wild.
So what's interesting is that on that trip, like, so I don't know if you remember seeing this. I know I was with Robert at the time, and we saw this dragon. Like, it was like this piece of like marble that was in the shape of a dragon.
Yeah, right by the far door there.
So that was from the Snow Center, I believe, or so.
Yes.
So doing some research on that, that's where the first basketball court at Kansas was, and
Okay.
it was like a biology. I want to say it was a biology building, and so the upstairs, like, there's pictures you can go online and get. Um, there's some pictures of that where they have like stuffed moose and like all these taxidermied animals, and the basement of it was a botany lab, and the description of it is that they basically the basement was split into two, and on one half was the botany lab, and on the other half was the basketball court, and they put a net up in the middle so that the ball wouldn't go in and break all the stuff in the botany lab. And there was like a big post in the middle of it, so people would like run into the post while they were playing. But yeah, like, you see the DeBruce Center, that this multi-million-dollar basketball stadium, which is awesome, and you think of like the humble beginnings of when he brought basketball there, and they just played it in the basement next to a botany lab. I think one of the things Robert said was like, it's basically like basketball started in Kansas and the Smithsonian. Like,
Right.
like, hey, let's start a court in the middle of the Smithsonian.
Well, it's funny when you say that is trying to drawing the connection, because helium was discovered at the University of Kansas, and I can't remember what building it was, but one of the buildings there on campus in the basement. So apparently, all kinds of really cool things come out of basements in Lawrence, Kansas.
Right. That's awesome.
But Lawrence is especially campus. Kind of specifically campus is really an odd area. This side of Kansas has a little more hills than most. You get out into western Kansas and it's very, very, very flat, very flat. Here it's, we've kind of got those Ozark hills a little bit, not much, but when you get to the campus for KU, it just like automatically goes from 0 to 100 and feels like you're in Arkansas or something. You just got these steep inclines, and it's really an odd little place, but lots of really, really neat history there. They did a fantastic job on the museum there in the DeBruce Center that we got to take you to. They had the original floor from the original court and everything still perfectly preserved.
Yeah.
Old uniforms, old letter jackets, all kinds of stuff. They did a really, really excellent job. If any of you guys watch and ever have the opportunity, just passing through Lawrence or something, it's open to the public. It's free, but it's really, really cool opportunity to stop in there and see some of that history right before your eyes. Really neat.
Yeah. It might take a little of the shine off of Naismith, though, because you'll learn that he was the only losing basketball coach in KU history. He invented the sport, but he couldn't coach to save his life.
Right, exactly.
Maybe that's why he didn't like coaching, because he wasn't good at it.
Yeah, that there's probably something to that.
Yeah,
there's probably something to that. But it's one of those things that everyone's kind of got their toolkit, and maybe coaching wasn't exactly his, but especially as we see tonight, he was able to bring some really, really bright light into the world in many different ways. So,
yeah. Something that's interesting is that, like, so I found a letter from McLendon to one of Naismith's descendants, and basically I want to say it was his granddaughter or grandniece, and he's starting to talk to him about his his time period with Naismith. He doesn't talk about basketball once.
Is that right?
Yep, he doesn't bring it up. I think he brings up athletics a little bit, but he doesn't really bring up basketball. What he does bring up is, he said, like, that Naismith was he was interested in these people, becoming better people, and that he goes on to tell this time that Naismith talked to them about the immortality of the soul and how it was different in a bunch of different cultures. So you have this minister this Christian minister in the 1930s talking about the immortality of the soul in like a comparative religion kind of way.
Wow.
And it's just another one of those things that the most important thing that after all that we just talked about with McClendon and Naismith, the most important thing he can talk about is a conversation they had on the immortality of the soul.
That's deep.
Yeah. So,
Very,
I mean,
very.
all the boundaries they broke together, that wasn't it. It was really, he's like, he cared about you being a good person.
Right.
And, that's who he was. That all the other stuff's kind of irrelevant at that point. And I think that's what really inspires me about Naismith is that he went out there and did the right thing. He went out there and tried to develop other people, and all he thought of himself was his instructor. He just, I mean, that's the kind of man I want to be. I don't know.
Right.
Like, if I can be
Right.
half the man that guy was, then I'll be doing pretty good in life.
Yeah, man, I think it would be so cool just to be a fly on the wall for one of those conversations. I mean, we think back to the mentoring aspect with McClendon there, and how much of it probably had zero to do with athletics, basketball, any of that. Going through that time period, and especially, being of a different race and dealing with those things and seeing that wholesome background that Naismith had. I mean, you can imagine some of the advice, insights, and stuff that Naismith probably shared. And man, what I would give to, just hear one conversation of that and how those conversations went, because I'm fairly certain they were very impactful.
Oh yeah, to be a student, in his class. And that's why the more I want to write a book about him at this point, and mostly just because I want to research more of it. And it's just, that's one story. We talked for almost an hour, and the majority
one
of
little
it was
bit,
one relationship.
yeah.
Right? And I mean, there had to be thousands of relationships that he had, with his.
Well, and that's the thing. It was a relationship that, while Naismith's name is much bigger than McClendon's, he also had this historical impact in his own way. I mean, think about all the people, all the connections throughout Naismith's life with just average nobodies, and how many more stories there are, is just mind blowing. It's one of those guys that probably truly changed the course of the world.
I think he did. And, I'm glad you said that, because I think one of the things I talk about in the talk, and it's one of the things that, those 13 rules, I forget who it was, but somebody, when we went to go see the rules, right, they were like, I don't know, it's just 13 rules. I don't want to go see that. And I'm like, man, like, okay, let's take this in context, right? These are 13 rules that this guy had somebody type up and posted to teach people a sport, right, at a school. Like, he was just solving a problem at a little school in Springfield, Massachusetts,
right,
with a couple thousand students at it probably at the time. And that sport has grown to where 2.2 billion people play it, and it's the third largest sport in the world. And it was all because this guy, who was an instructor, right, not inventor, not anything else, he's just an instructor, this humble guy, invents this sport, and it touches the lives currently today, not historically, currently today, 2.2 billion people. So add up historically all the people it's touched along the way since 1891, and think about the impact of an idea, and that fact of what we talked about in the beginning about trying to have an impact on your world and making the world a better place. That he's proof that you can do that.
Yeah.
And it's just, to me, it's amazing. It really is. And call this kind of divine providence too. It's kind of funny. And I didn't tell you this earlier, but my boss took us out to lunch today, and he's like, "Where do you want to go?" And we didn't really think of where we were going to go. And he goes, "Let's go to Plan B Burger." For those of you that aren't from Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, Plan B Burger is in the Naismith Hall of Fame, Basketball Hall of Fame.
Okay.
So I actually ate lunch about, I'd say like 400 yards from the James Naismith statue outside the Basketball Hall of Fame.
That's cool.
Totally unintentional. Just that I didn't plan to do that. We never go there. Like first time we ever gone there together. He's like, "Let's go there." I'm like, "Yeah, cool. I'm in."
Well, now I got to get up there. I got to have a burger there. That sounds amazing.
Right.
But you know, even past, you're talking about over 2 billion people. Even past that, I mean, you can't go into a store today. Even grocery stores have a basketball in it for sale. You go to Dollar General, anywhere. Basketball is so integrated into the culture worldwide these days that, I mean, even beyond the organized sport of it, like basketball's everywhere. And how mind blowing would that be if he was able to join us today just for an hour and just see how what he created one day on a whim has truly impacted the entire world.
Oh yeah,
It's
he
just
wouldn't even
insane.
recognize it, right? Those 13 rules, like I'm pretty sure we don't follow
Yeah.
any of them at this point.
Exactly.
Like they didn't
Just
dribble
gotta do
back
away.
then. You know, there was all kinds of different things. Like none of that stuff was, you know, he saw some of it get put into place, but um, it's such a simple sport. But that's kind of the beauty of it, is because you have these 13 simple rules that starts it, and one of the rules, the unwritten rules, the 14th rule is probably change these rules to suit your own specific needs. Like
Yeah.
one of the rules, like I like to point out to people, there isn't one rule that addresses how many people are on the team. So the first basketball games, some of them had like 50 people on a court.
That's insane. I remember we were talking about that in the museum there. That's insane.
Yeah. And like in a Masonic lodge, the Trenton, New Jersey, I think is the first Masonic lodge. That was the first basketball cage. Like, you know how they call, a lot of basketball, especially in colleges, it'll be called the cage or something like that. I think UMass is the cage. There was basketball cages because it shortened the game because you didn't have ball going out of bounds a lot. So, and it would keep the spectators from interfering with the game. But there's actually Masonic lodges where they had cages in there so they could play basketball. You don't see that kind of stuff now, but it's just amazing that none of that would have been the way the sport is today. He wouldn't have seen it, never mind the Euro step. Like I can't figure that out, but he would totally be lost with that.
Right.
Just so many different things that he wouldn't have seen. But one thing he would recognize is the fact that to this day, the fact that it is such an inexpensive sport that all you need is a backboard, a basket. You don't even need the net half the time,
Right.
and a ball, and that the transformative nature that sport has in the inner cities, and is amazing. And it continued to break barriers more and more. Another Massachusetts Freemason was Red Auerbach, who follows in his footsteps in some regards, and he ends up drafting the first African American player, and he ends up appointing the first African American coach in the NBA. It's always broken barriers, and it continues to do so. And it's baked in. Like there's some people that'll tell you, like some people that you and I probably wouldn't be friends with, but there are some people that'll tell you that like basketball is far from its roots. And I safe to say that basketball is exactly doing what it should be today, and continuing to serve to help make people better and help them change their communities and make the world around them a better place. And it does it all over the world.
Beautifully put, brother. Well, we have had an epic conversation this evening. And as you stated, we talked about one bit of this amazing man's life. So much more that can be discussed. And I really, really do truly hope that you go through with writing that book, because that's something that needs to be done. And I'm thrilled to look forward to reading that one day. But definitely want to thank you so much for coming on. We're just past the 9 o'clock hour. We typically do a traditional toast at the end of these, and I wanted to see if you would be kind enough to offer us up a toast this evening.
Sure. I'd like to offer a toast to all the brothers, and I guess you and I would be included in that want to make an impact in the world, and make a toast that may we all have the fortune and the tenacity to make an impact like Brother Naismith did.
Hear, hear. Cheers. Fantastic. Well, brother, thank you so much for coming on this evening. Before we wrap up, I do want to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts you might have this evening.
I want to thank you for having me come on. I know this is something I'm really passionate about, just because of what he means to the world and what he means to me. And I love having the opportunity to share this, especially with you. Especially we have that connection, being that he was from both places. But really, like I said, kind of reiterate, is that if we can take anything from this, I think we take it that a man with a simple idea, a little virtue, and a little elbow grease can change the world. If that's what he sets out to do. So that's kind of what I want to leave everybody with.
That's fantastic, man, and very, very beautifully put. I do want to give you an opportunity here. I know you've had so many efforts in Masonry, and thank you so much for all that you do for the craft. One of the exciting ones recently is you guys have picked up a project that Robert Johnson originally started and have brought it back to life in an amazing way. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that podcast that you're involved in.
Yeah, so we picked up the Masonic Curators podcast. Brian and I reached out to Keith McKinnon and John Wilder. Keith McKinnon's from Cambridge, the Cambridge Lodge. And I don't know if you ever got a chance to see it when you were up here, but when Keith was in charge of that up there, he amassed a library of 20,000 Masonic artifacts in that lodge building. It no longer looks like that at this point. There's some of it up there, but it's not the extent it used to be. And John Wilder is a historian for Aleppo Shrine in Boston. And so Brian and I just asked, they started a group called the Masonic Historical Preservation Society. And it's just a group of collectors and historians that are really, really passionate about preserving our Masonic heritage and our Masonic history. And they're not afraid to dive in a dumpster to save some of the stuff that lodges just throw away. And I know you've seen it. I mean, these guys are awesome. They're hilarious. They're very passionate. They're very knowledgeable. And really, Brian and I, we take a back seat. I edit the videos and I sit there and record with them. But the basic way we're doing it right now is that we'll go to a lodge and film in that lodge with the east as the backdrop usually, and they'll bring some objects that they want to talk about, and we'll have somebody from the lodge bring some objects out of their personal histories of the lodge, out of their collections, and we'll have somebody from the lodge talk about it. And they're all 5 to 10 minute episodes. And I think we're on episode 40 right now. I think this week will be 40. And it's going to be about a year. Well, 12 weeks, I guess, will be a year, because we put them out once a week on Monday mornings. And they're just phenomenal. I mean, Keith McKinnon can talk to you about, there's literally one on there that's already released, so I'm not telling you anything. He talks about a porcelain plate and traces the history of that plate to the American Standard toilet bowl. Right.
And Keith is an amazing guy. I've had some great conversations with him.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I just love to watch it. Like, they'll be like, "Are you going to do one?" And I'm like, "No, no, I'm just having fun watching you guys." And, and John brings this stuff out that, like, he brings the shrine history out, and Shrinedom's not really known for its history, right? Like, for the most part, they don't really care about it. Um, but he brings some stuff out, and it's amazing some of the stuff that he's bringing out. There was what was the other day? It was an original Paul Revere spoon that was given to Harold Lloyd, who was the silent movie actor. The
Yeah.
safety first kind of thing, where he's hanging off the clock. Um, so he ties it into that, like he ties this thing in. He's got this. He doesn't have the Revere spoon, but he has like these other artifacts or these magazines that the shrine used to have, where they're like original short stories. I mean, it's just the stuff that they bring up. I'm having fun. I'm having a ball, like, just editing this stuff, because I'm going searching. Like, if they'll just drop some random fact, and I'll go search some stuff on, on Google or whatever, and put some pictures up to support it, and it's just amazing. I mean, and we filmed in some pretty cool lodges. I mean, we filmed in one of the lodges was a King Solomon's Lodge. They created the Bunker Hill Memorial, the monument.
Oh, wow.
The original one, the wooden one, and there's still a piece of it in their lodge.
Oh, wow.
And so we show that. We show some original Paul Revere charters, jewels, the sign for the slate sign from the Bunker Hill Monument, which is in somebody's garden face down, and they found it.
Of course.
Yeah. A lodge we haven't released this one yet, but there's a lodge in Rhode Island. The timbers of the lodge, like in the ceiling, the beams in the ceiling are from a scuttled Revolutionary War era ship. They scuttled it so that the British couldn't come in the bay in Rhode Island. And these guys were like, "Well, we're going to build a lodge. We need some wood. Where are we going to get the wood?" And they're like, "Well, we sunk that ship out there, so why don't we go get the timbers from that ship?" And this is the part of their lodge. And oh man, that's such a beautiful lodge. The paintings in the lodge are a brother they wanted him to do something based on Egyptian, like an Egyptian motif. He goes to the Boston Library and pulls out the Egyptian Book of the Dead and creates the story of Freemasonry panel by panel, only using art from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Oh, wow.
And this is like 360 degree of the lodge room. So, I mean, that one's coming out soon. I think pretty soon. It's just amazing. You just be amazed at the stuff that these guys find.
That's fantastic. Well, we will make sure that we get the link to your guys' show in the show notes for this episode. I encourage you guys all to go check them out, like and subscribe to the Masonic Curators, another group of guys that are preserving and telling history so it carries on to the next generation. So, my brother, thank you so much for coming on this evening, for sharing your knowledge, and for all that you do for the craft today. Please thank your family for letting us borrow you away for a little bit this evening, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us live this evening, and we will see you in 2 weeks right back here on Historical Light. Have a great evening.